Good evening and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Tonight is a collab with the Harry Bridges School of Labor on the Great Flint Sit-Down Strike of 1936-37. And of course, 3 days ago was the 88th anniversary of the Battle of the Running Bulls, a key turning point in the Flint Sit-Down Strike, which is why we decided to start this collaboration. I want to thank you all for making it tonight. Before we get started, just a few reminders. The People's School is initiated and sponsored by the Party of Communist USA, but it's not a party school, which is great because it allows us to have a wide variety of ideas and opinions discussed that don't necessarily reflect the party line. And of course, the Harry Bridges School of Labor is presented by Labor United Educational League. And at the Harry Bridges School of Labor, our purpose is to educate the workers of America on the strength of unions and to foster a class-conscious workforce. We aim to connect the struggles of the past with the struggles of today to empower the labor movement to transform from their present hopeless defensive fight into an aggressive attack upon capital. We plan to empower workers with knowledge, regardless of industry or type of work, bringing all workers to a class-oriented trade union movement. And once again, tonight's class is on the Flint Sit-Down Strike. What we'll be learning today, we're going to give an overview on what is a sit-down strike, and we'll discuss the early organizing at General Motors. Then we'll go into the beginning of the strike actions, and then we'll go into the life as a sit-downer. And this is mainly a prep because next month's where we're going to get into the juicier parts of the strike, for lack of a better term.
What is a sit-down strike? Organizing at General Motors. A sit-down strike is a labor strike in which an organized group of workers, usually employed at factories or other centralized locations, take possession of the workplace by sitting down at their stations. U.S. workers found the sit-down to have many advantages over the traditional forms of strike. It prevents the use of scabs to operate a factory, since the strikers guard the machines. It is harder for the company to oust men from inside a plant than break through an encircling picket line. Bosses are more reluctant to resort to strike-breaking violence because it directly endangers millions of dollars of company property, vast assembly lines, and unfinished products. The use of machine guns, tear gas, and gangsters is much less effective. It is harder to label strikers aggressors while they are inside. In a sit-down, the workers' morale is heightened. They are inside, and therefore know for certain that scabs are not operating the machines. They are really protecting their jobs, and this leads to a higher degree of solidarity and militancy. The men are protected from weather. They are never scattered, but are always on call at a moment's notice in case of trouble. The basic democratic character of the sit-down is guaranteed by the fact that the workers on the line, rather than outside officials, determine its course. Finally, defense against labor spies, a constant threat in the 30s, is perfected because a sit-down can be started by one or two rank-and-file leaders over an issue that affects the entire plant. The workers vote by putting down their tools. In 1936, General Motors employed 55% of all U.S. auto workers in 69 plants and was bigger than Ford and Chrysler combined. 350 of its officers and directors were paid $10 million in salaries that year. Its top two officers, Alfred Sloan and William Knudsen, received $370,000 each in 1935. Its seventh vice president, one Charles Wilson, received $190,000. The giant was controlled by the DuPont interests, which owned about a quarter of the stock. The condition of the auto workers was in stark contrast to that of their bosses. In 1935, a year in which the government declared $1,600 as the minimum income on which a family of four could live decently, the average auto worker took home $900. Most lived in fearful insecurity. A foreman could fire at will. Layoffs between the old and new model year lasted from 3 to 5 months, without unemployment insurance. A compulsory loan system prevailed. under which GM deducted principal plus interest on the workers' return to employment in the fall, cutting wages 10%. As low as the Eagles were, it was the speed up that made life intolerable. One worker's wife described her husband as coming home so dog tired he couldn't even walk upstairs to bed, but crawled on his hands and knees. Conditions were described as follows. The men worked like fiends, their jaws set and eyes on fire. Nothing in the world exists for them except the line chases bearing down on them relentlessly. They come along on a conveyor, and as each passes, the worker has to finish his particular job before the next one bears down on him. The line moves fast, and the chases are close together. The men move like lightning. Some are underneath on their backs on little carts, propelling themselves by their heels all day long, fixing something underneath the chases as they move along. Flint workers were described as having a peculiar gray, jaundiced color, like a city of tuberculars. And in July 1936, when temperatures soared over 100 degrees, deaths in Michigan's auto plants rose into the hundreds. The speed up was intensified by the ever-present threat of layoffs. The fear of layoff is always in the minds, even if it is not definitely brought there by the foreman. The speed up is thus inherent in the lack of steady work and an army of unemployed waiting outside. It was the speed up that created the conditions that led the workers to the workers organizing. If any worker had strange ideas in his head about a union, a vast network of company spies was present to ferret him out immediately. A Senate subcommittee of the Committee on Education and Labor, headed by Robert La Follette, revealed that GM spent $839,000 in 1934 alone on detective work, more than half of it paid to the Pinkerton Agency. Hundreds of spies worked in the plants, seeking out those who had union inclinations. GM was a member of the National Metal Trades Association, a company group that supplied labor spies to terrorize workers and import scabs and helped set up company unions to break or forestall legitimate unions. The committee reported that the Justice Department and Navy and Army intelligence worked with this outfit in union-busting forays. In addition, GM used the forces of the notorious Black Legion, a DuPont-financed terror group that beat, tarred, feathered, and murdered active unionists. GM foremen were actually seen donning black robes inside the plant in preparation for a Black Legion raid. Organized force inside the plants had to be defeated to bring the union to auto. Attempts had been made to fight the auto moguls early in the Depression. In July 1930, a communist-led union struck Fisher Body No. 1 and marched into downtown Flint with banners flying, "In 1776, we fought for liberty. Today, we fight for bread." Prior to this, there had been little organizing attempted in the auto industry. In 1933, Llewellyn's predecessor organization, the Trade Union Unity League, TUL, created the Auto Workers Union along industrial lines. It conducted strikes which eventually involved tens of thousands and which were met with ferocious brutality, especially at the Briggs Auto Works in Flint. The TUL-type militancy not only earned the hatred of the corporations, but also of the sellout business unionism of the AFL national leadership. The AFL, since its birth, had opposed the organization of unskilled workers, and especially along industrial lines. That is, placing all the different types of workers in one plant into the same union. The AFL had intended all along to keep auto workers divided, both along craft lines and from one plant or company to the next. It organized federal locals for this purpose, groups of workers in a particular plant responsible directly to the National Federation and barred from joining together with all other auto workers on an industry-wide basis. These locals were ruled by national officers and an executive board appointed by AFL President William Green. When the AFL attempted to step into the auto industry soon after the Briggs strikes, tool locals, in a move for unity, dissolved and joined the AFL federal locals. The entrance of the tool left-wing militants into these locals was a first step towards the creation of an industrial union. Disregarding the interests of the rank and file while negotiating with the companies, the AFL leadership sacrificed every single demand, including the essential one for union recognition. Thousands of auto workers made huge bonfires of their union cards and quit in disgust. The left-wingers organized the Cleveland Auto Council, which sponsored another national conference at which 37 locals were represented. And again, the AFL intervened to try to prevent an industrial union from forming. Even a government report warned that because of insecurity, low annual earnings, inequitable hiring and rehiring methods, espionage, speed up, and displacement of workers at an extremely early age, unless something is done soon, they intend to take things into their own hands to get results. Finally, with pressure growing for the mass organization of auto workers, agreement was won in May 1936 to give the auto workers autonomy inside the AFL for what was, in effect, an industrial union. The infant UAW, along with the other unions affiliated to the newly emerging Committee for Industrial Organization, were suspended in August by the AFL leadership because of their industrial union concepts. Wyndham Mortimer, a militant left-winger who led the local which he helped organize at Cleveland's White Motor Company, UAW's first vice president, was put in charge of organizing GM. When Mortimer arrived to begin his work in the summer of 1936, there were barely 100 union members in the city, and the majority of those were company spies. All the others, 20,000 of them, had quit. The sellout policies of the AFL leadership and Roosevelt's intervention had helped the auto companies destroy any union organization, however shaky, that had existed in Flint. Recognizing the stoolie-ridden AFL-organized Flint local for what it was, Mortimer set about organizing a completely independent group, visiting workers from door to door, signing them up, and sending the records to UAW national headquarters. This enraged the GM labor spies, but, though tailed and watched at every turn, Mortimer succeeded in keeping membership lists out of their hands. He began publishing a newsletter which went out to 7,000 workers each week. He also organized a secret union group in the Fisher Body No. 1 Body in White department, where the main soldering and welding was done. When Homer Martin, the AFL leadership-supported UAW president, saw Mortimer succeeding, he pressed for his removal. Mortimer succumbed, but managed to arrange for Robert Travis to take his place. In the early 30s, Travis had been successful in leading and organizing Toledo Chevrolet. He shared Mortimer's left-wing views and was regarded as a top-flight organizer despite his youth. Slowly but surely, the UAW gained strength. The fact that the discredited AFL had suspended the CIO-affiliated AFL unions helped draw workers into the new industrial union. Seniority arrangements were won at Chrysler Dodge. In Fisher Body, union stickers began to appear on auto bodies and carry their message the length of the assembly line. With GM supporting Landon for president, but losing as the workers voted for Roosevelt overwhelmingly, the union began to resist the corporation more strongly. 7 stoppages, provoked by speed up and wage cuts, occurred at Fisher Body No. 1 in the second week of November, 1936. On November 9th, Travis met with 40 members, key men from each department, to plan how to organize a sit-down should an incident occur. 3 days later, on November 12th, it did. A foreman eliminated 1 man from a 3-man unit and ordered the other 2 to do the work of 3. Although the other 2 were not union members, they stopped working and were fired the next morning.
And with that, we'll break for our first discussion period. So I want to give a quick note. In preparation to this, I was listening back to the Harry Bridges School of Labor class on the Flint Sit-Down Strike. And if anybody was there on that class or listened, I was incorrect when I said that sit-down strikes were banned by Taft-Hartley. They were actually banned before Taft-Hartley. And let me just find it. They were banned in 1939 by the Supreme Court in a ruling in the case NLRB versus Fan Steel Metallurgical Corporation. So it actually predates Taft-Hartley, and it was a Supreme Court decision that outlawed the sit-down strike.
Yeah, so at the beginning, they mentioned the reason for the sit-down strike, or for the tension at least, was the speed ups, as well as the fear of layoffs. So, I think we've been discussing this a bit, but automation, it's just an interesting aspect that I don't know if it was automation in this case, because it's a speed up. I'm assuming, did they just have to work harder? My guess is it was automation, though, to some extent, since the auto industry.
At this time, explicitly, I do not believe it was automation, but automation definitely is a speed up, essentially.
Got it. Thank you.
And speed ups were rampant in this time. Pretty much most strikes at this time were due to speed ups. You go back to 1929 at Estonia, speed up was a main cause, a leading cause of that strike as well.
Yeah, the speed ups there, that it's not directly automation. It was forcing people to work harder and faster, which tended to be a safety issue. If you saw, there's a Charlie Chaplin film called Modern Times. It's probably one of the best illustrations that I can, if you just check that out, like it's humorous, but it illustrates the tension that speed ups cause.
Thank you. If you're looking for something humorous, plus wasn't that I Love Lucy, what episode where they were on the assembly line?
Hi. So since the AFL was opposed to industrial organization in the past and was ousting CIO members, what is the character of the AFL-CIO now that they're joined up now?
There is still a lot of that craft union mentality. Of course, in the old craft unions, though there is industrial unionism isn't the redheaded stepchild it was in the 30s, but it is a backward step. There's still a lot of backwards ideas in leadership, and even during the George Meany times of leadership, the AFL, which were going into the 70s, 80s, George Meany was still a staunch craft unionist. The current leadership, not so much. But there is still some of that thinking, and especially in the craft unions, it's rampant. But the AFL-CIO is still strictly a business union, although not a craft union in and of itself.
Sorry, another thing that just kind of sparked my wait, what kind of moment was when they were talking about the labor spies, how enraged they were when the unions went to go organize doorstep. Well, yeah, you would expect them to be. Of course, they're enraged, but did they go actually go? How dare you do this? I mean, I just thought that was an interesting little tidbit. Maybe that was just saying they made their jobs harder as spies. I don't know.
Well, of course, Wyndham Mortimer was the lead at that time that diverted the previously organized workers that were, that union that was loaded with spies. Wyndham Mortimer was an old Communist Party member, and of course, it took someone along that line of thinking to think outside the box and to avert the path where all the company spies were already waiting for them.
I'm assuming that sit-down strikes are still illegal.
Yes.
Okay, however, they do put them under now wildcat strikes. I mean, even though they're illegal, it appears not very often, but people still do some. I think the latest one was December 2008. Is that correct?
I couldn't give you that off the top of my head.
Okay.
The union leadership's not gonna approve a sit-down strike. So it would have to be a wildcat strike if one was to take place. For those that don't know, a wildcat strike is a strike that does not have the consent of union leadership and is essentially done by the rank and file itself without the blessing of the union.
I was just going to comment towards the next comment about the labor spies being outraged. At this time, and even to this day, you know, a lot of management, like there was a lot of paternalism. Like they saw their workers like their children. Like, you know, there was an attitude of you know, we know what's best for you. How dare you break away and form something independent that we don't have control over. And that's still rampant today, even in union shops. And then I guess I'd respond to the 2008 sit down at Republic Windows and Doors in Chicago was a UE strike. It was actually sanctioned by the union, so it was not a wildcat. And the end result after 2 sales is it became a workers' cooperative. The employees ended up buying out the company.
Wow.
And they still exist today. They're still they're still employed, still a union shop. But yeah, wildcat strikes are I don't know if they're not necessarily illegal. They're just unprotected, and that kind of leaves it in a gray area where the employer can respond however they see fit within the bounds of the law, and the union can be fined. There was a wildcat strike at UPS a few years ago in New York, and that local was fined thousands of dollars for lost revenue or lost production. So they do still occur. Wildcats do still occur, just not very, very often.
Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, the teacher strikes in 2018 across the Bible Belt in the South were wildcat strikes, and they supposedly started what was this big strike wave that happened recently. And thank you for that. I completely forgot about Republic Steel. That was a great one, and yeah, they're still around, and we still promote them as a worker co-op.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, going off some of the rhetoric you hear that these days when the company says, "Oh, we're a big family. Why would you want to go against your family members, or you don't want these outsiders coming in?" You hear that at every other company meeting these days. Ugh. And then I had another thought, but I forgot it.
Yeah, thank you. The good old pizza parties.
Hey, yep. You mentioned it before, but the West Virginia strike, although it was endorsed by the West Virginia branch of the AFT, the national level did not endorse it. And that strike did end successfully in West Virginia, at least. They succeeded in getting that pay increase that they were demanding, because they were actually being offered a 1% increase for the next 3 years and a freeze on premiums for their health insurance. So I think they negotiated something like 4 or 5% graduated over a course of several years. But that did receive some level of endorsement from the AFT at the local level. And it was also successful partially due to the fact that there were so few teachers already that the state could not afford to have any of the teachers go on strike. I think that's in West Virginia, only about like half of the teaching positions were filled by actual qualified teachers. All right, that's all.
Thank you. Yeah, and that'll happen with a lot of wildcat strikes. They'll start off without as a movement of the rank and file itself, but most of the time the union will come on board and support it. And of course, it wasn't just West Virginia; it was all over. All of those strikes started out as wildcat strikes. With that, we'll move to our second section.
Section 2, strike actions begin. Organizing at GM continued. On the incoming night shift, word spread throughout the 7,000-man plant. Nobody starts working. The foreman seized the man who had been removed from the group and began to shove him toward the plant superintendent. Simons stepped in and stopped him while the entire assembly line watched. A committee was picked on the spot to meet with the boss as a committee. The first time this had ever happened at Fisher Body. The super was stunned. He gave in and agreed to rehire the 2 workers who had been fired. But the men, in spite of an agreement that they would not be docked for time lost in the stoppage, still refused to go back to work. They demanded that the 2 workers be brought back to the plant. The company was forced to broadcast over local and police radio to find the 2 men, one of whom was on a date with this girl. No one started working until he had driven her home, changed his clothes, and reported for work. The story spread through Flint like wildfire. Workers began signing up by the hundreds. GM was forced to bargain with various units on day-to-day grievances. The decision was made by the UAW leadership not to call a national strike until Fisher Body in Flint and Cleveland were ready, which Travis estimated would take another month. On December 28th, the first action occurred at Fisher Body in Cleveland, where the workers in the quarter panel department yanked the power when the plant manager postponed a bargaining session for a few hours. All other departments followed, and by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the plant was dead. Through the mediation of Mayor Harold Burton, later a Supreme Court justice, GM tried to bargain on a local basis, but the union turned down the ruse. A unanimous vote at a plant mass meeting decided the sit-down would be ended only as a part of a national settlement. This action had disrupted the timetable of even the UAW leadership, which had planned to begin strike action against GM in Flint. A few weeks later, the Cleveland workers had to leave the plant and conduct their strike from the outside because they did not have the strength to maintain the sit-down. It was the Flint workers who had to carry the ball. The strike begins. The Flint workers got their chance at Fisher Body number 1 on December 30th, only 2 days after the start of the Cleveland sit-down. When the night shift came on at number 1 on the 30th, they found that the company had backed up a string of railroad cars and was starting to move dies. This was the GM version of the runaway shop, an open attempt to shift production to a plant where the union was weak, and thus destroy Fisher Body number 1 as a decisive unit. Travis was notified at the union office across the street. He immediately called the workers to a lunch hour meeting by the prearranged signal of a 200-watt red lamp, which the workers could see flickering in the union headquarters. When they had filled the hall, Travis said, "What do we do about the dies?" A worker answered, "Well, them's our jobs. We want them left right here in Flint." Travis reviewed the company moves. He pointed out that the Cleveland workers were out on strike to save their jobs, and again he asked, "What do we do?" "Shut her down, shut the goddamn plant," came the cry. Henry Krause, a UAW editor at the meeting, describes the scene. The men stood still facing the door. It was like trying to chain a natural force. They couldn't hold back and started crowding forward. Then suddenly they broke through the door and made a race for the plant gates, running in every direction towards the quarter-mile-long buildings. The workers inside immediately began to secure the plant against any attacker. They moved scores of unfinished Buick bodies in front of all entrances to form a gigantic barricade. With acetylene torches, they welded a steel frame around every door. Bulletproof metal sheets were put in position to cover every window, while holes were carved in them and threaded to allow the nozzles of fire hoses to be screwed into them. Wet clothes were kept in readiness to be placed on the face as protection against tear gas attacks. Large supplies of metal parts were placed in strategic spots. Paint guns for spraying would-be invaders were located throughout the plant. The back-to-work whistle blew, but there was no movement. Suddenly, the third-floor windows were flung open to reveal workers waving arms and shouting, "Hooray, Bob, she's ours!" The women of the cut and sew department were told to report to union headquarters. Nearly all the remaining 3,000 night workers struck. A simultaneous sit-down in the smaller Fisher No. 2 took place, grounding GM body production to a halt. Thousands of stop orders went out to suppliers and assembly plants all over the country. On January 1st, all Chevrolet and Buick assembly plants were closed. By January 7th, 100,000 GM workers were idle. On January 3rd, a national union conference of 300 from 10 cities met in Flint and formulated demands: union recognition for the UAW, reinstatement of all workers fired because of union membership or activity, seniority to govern all layoffs, new wage minimums, a 30-hour 5-day week with time and 1/2 for overtime, abolition of piecework, and a slowing down of the assembly line. Strike strategy begins to take shape. The press attacked the sit-downers. There were constant references to Lewis's strike, and Lewis ordering the men in or out, and Lewis ordering the strike at strategic points, referring to CIO President John Lewis, as if the rank and file had determined nothing. The workers in Fisher Body No. 1 paid little heed to the rantings of GM and its press. Once inside, they set about organizing one of the most effective strike apparatuses ever seen in the United States. Immediately after securing the plant, they held a mass meeting and elected a committee of stewards and a strike strategy committee of 5 to govern the strike. Then committees were organized: food, police, information, sanitation, and health, safety, kangaroo court, entertainment, education, and athletics. Since all committees were democratically elected, their authority was unquestioned. The supreme body remained the 1,200 who stayed to hold the plant, the rest being sent outside to perform other tasks. 2 meetings of the entire plant were held daily at which any change could be made in the administration. The police committee was responsible for guarding every entrance to the plant and posted the names and shifts of every man on the bulletin boards. Within this committee of 65, the most trusted workers constituted the special patrol. Their job was to make a complete 35-minute round of the plant every hour, 24 hours a day, throughout the entire strike. They would check out all rumors and report any violations of rules or discipline. Violators were tried by the court and initially given minor punishments. After 3 convictions, a striker was sent out. And there's a diagram of the organization inside of Fisher Plant No. 1. And at the top, there's the supreme body with the 12,000 workers, where they had 2 daily meetings. And underneath that, the 5-man strike strategy committee. And below that, the 17 shop stewards responsible for the committees and all of the rest of the other committees underneath them. No one could enter or leave the plant unless checked out by the reception committee. A reception committee of 5 searched my party and car for weapons outside the plant. Then we walked up to the plant itself. All doors were shut and barricaded. I climbed onto a pile of packing bags and swung over a heavy horizontally hinged steel door into the plant. On a platform inside, there was another reception committee which checked credentials again. Such care was necessary since the company was always attempting to spread rumors of scandals inside. They even smuggled a prostitute in another guise into the plant, but she was discovered and sent packing.
And with that, we'll break for a second discussion round. Angelo, New York, you have the floor.
Okay. As we're listening to this, you cannot not think that the job of communists is to be involved with unions. You have to take that away from this. That's the obvious thing. We mentioned some people, Mortimer with the United Auto Workers, who was in the CP, and there were others. Remember, all of them. So to be a communist means you have to be involved with a union. That's really the essence. Now, of course, it's not required. And you can be a communist without working in the unions. But this is the essence. It is the essence of Marxism, that the working class, the proletariat, are the only ones capable of changing things through social revolution. Anything other than that thinking is not Marxism. And if it's not Marxism, it's not communism. So remember this. When people say that they're communists, see what they do. See how many of them are on the internet and are not even working. See how many are unemployed. See how many are students that they don't pay rent, they don't buy food for themselves, their folks take care of them, and they're talking about communism. Just think of this. So when you see these groups popping up, communist this and communist that, ask yourself who is behind it. And don't be shocked if you don't see there's no workers behind it. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade.
Yeah, I just found the like internal organizing that they did like very fascinating. Like if we looked at that chart that they had with how they organized everyone, it said that they had like a opera section, yeah, like an orchestra, a theater, boxing, wrestling, and ping pong and basketball. Did they really do all of that inside of the factory?
Yes, and we'll get more into that in the next section. But yes, it was the organization that it took to organize the strike, and it was a bottom up. It was rank and file led. If you remember in the first section, they talked about not being ready to strike until two key plants were ready to strike. This was the workers decided when they were ready. In a way, this was probably the most spontaneous of the organizing drives within the CIO at the time. But like anything else, when you have some type of spontaneous action, if you don't have working class, let's say if you don't have communist leadership, that spontaneity will fizzle away. And we've seen that in countless movements. So that's why with key organizers like Wyndham Mortimer, and there was many others. If we remember, of course, we had a lot of these organizers came from Tool and earlier formations that were trying to be organized largely by the communists. That's what we had. That leadership was there, and that helped organize a lot of the work that was going on within the Fisher body. Number one.
The organization that they put together reminds me of like a factory Soviet. The way that they elected everybody and could recall them, and it just reminds me of a kind of spontaneous factory Soviet, maybe from a little bit before the revolution. But anyway, that's it.
All right, if there's no more questions or comments, we'll go to our last section for tonight.
Section 3, Life as a Sit-Downer. Life as a sit-downer. Inside, every worker had a specific duty for 6 hours a day. They were on duty for 3 hours, off for 9, on 3, and off 9, in each 24-hour period. Every day at 3 p.m., there was a general cleanup. No matter how cold the weather, all windows were opened wide and teams of workers moved in waves on and in between the assembly lines for the entire length of the plant, leaving it spick and span. Personal cleanliness also took high priority, every worker taking a shower a day. The strikers divided themselves into social groups of 15, setting up house in some cozy corner and living family style for the duration. They made mattresses of car cushions, took out the seats, and made beds of the car floors. Every visitor was impressed with the extreme neatness and care taken with all plant property. A plant post office was established to handle all mail, which included censoring every letter. Daily visits were arranged whereby workers' children could be handed through a window while workers talked to their wives as they stood outside. At one point, the organization was so confident of its fortress that workers who lived nearby were allowed the liberty of going home for a day at a time. The monotony and boredom away from the family was probably the most difficult problem to overcome. Calisthenics were organized daily. The entire plant was wired with a loudspeaker system. A 12-piece orchestra was organized from among the strikers, and concerts were broadcast every evening. Each social group had either a radio or a phonograph. Ping pong, checkers, chess, cards, using washers as money were provided. The bottoms were knocked out of 2 wastebaskets and a basketball court set up. Boxing and wrestling teams were organized. The strikers took to writing poems and songs, the best of which were published in the union paper. They put on skits lampooning the foreman, GM, and its bosses. Labor classes were held daily in the history of the labor movement, and instructions given in parliamentary procedure, how to run a union meeting, and in the Union Constitution. A living newspaper was presented to allow the workers to act out the specific events of the strike as it went along. Dramatic groups were invited, and Detroit's contemporary theater put on plays. One local movie owner sent entertainers, and another who refused to help out was boycotted after the strike. Charlie Chaplin donated his current movie, Modern Times, and film showings were held. A writing class was led by a graduate student from the University of Michigan, and workers took to writing plays. The Women's Auxiliary, which was to play a key role in the strike, organized dancing representing all national groups in front of the plant. They formed living formations or mass charades to describe phrases like solidarity forever or sole collective bargaining agent. The organization outside the plant was no less efficient and vital to the existence of the workers inside. Union headquarters at Pengelly Hall was the hub. Committees were established for food preparation, publicity, welfare, and relief, pickets and defense, and union growth. The responsibility of feeding several thousand workers, both inside and outside the plants, was enormous. The union kitchen was headed by Dorothy Krause, wife of the union editor, and a union chef from a large Detroit hotel. Food transportation was handled by the city's bus drivers, who remembered the solidarity of the auto workers in the bus strike. 200 people, mostly women, prepared this food. Some crates of fruit were kept inside for snacks and carefully guarded against poisoning. As it later turned out, a Pinkerton agent was on the inside food committee. Several hundred workers gave their cars for use by the union. Sound equipment, guarded day and night, was used to talk to the sit-downers from outside the plant. The Flint auto worker was distributed by the tens of thousands. A chiseling committee was set up to collect food and supplies. 2/3 of what was needed was obtained in this fashion. The committee going from house to house and to small shopkeepers. The union headquarters became the center of life for thousands of workers who streamed in and out, bringing their families along. A nursery was set up to take care of the children while their mothers were working for the strike. There was constant communication between the outside strike leaders and the strike committee inside. Picketing took place around the clock in front of the plant. The fantastic spirit and organization of the workers spread across the nation. Sit-downs became a national phenomenon. Workers the country over grabbed newspapers each day to see if the boys in Flint were still holding out. Companion strikes sparked new methods of organization. Only one reason could drag one sit-downer at the Philadelphia Exide Battery Co. Outside, he was married at the plant gates. The entire country was union conscious. Solidarity with the strikers. Support poured in from all over the country. Despite the attempt of the National AFL to sabotage the strike, its city central bodies in Flint, Detroit, Cleveland, and Minneapolis backed the sit-downers with all sorts of aid. The United Rubber Workers, Goodyear local, sent $3,000. $6,000 came from UAW at Studebaker. Trucks of food arrived from Akron. The Hudson and Chrysler workers began a 1 hour a day club, 1 hour's wages each day donated to the strike fund. Veterans formed a union labor post number 1 to counteract the patriotic scabbing, in quotes, organized by flag wavers. Even small businessmen joined the ranks. One drugstore owner telling a reporter, "This whole block of stores is solid for the union. Hell, I never got anything out of GM dividends. A union victory is better for my business." General Motors counterattack. As production decreased daily, GM turned to their courts for an injunction with which to oust the strikers. It was a ticklish legal situation, since workers were in no way harming the machinery, and in fact kept the plants in better shape than the company had. The tactic was so new, said one observer, that no existing law has any relevance in regard to it. But that, of course, wouldn't stop GM. It got an injunction from Genesee County Judge Edward D. Black. County Sheriff Tom Walcott went to the plants to read it to the workers, ordering them out in 24 hours. As the nervous sheriff stood on a table in the Fisher No. 1 cafeteria reading the writ, workers laughed at him and broke out into solidarity forever. When he had finished, needless to say, the workers refused to budge. With GM set to request an order for removal, one of the union attorneys dug up information which proved to be a bombshell. Judge Black owned 3,665 shares of GM stock worth $219,000.38. Michigan law stated that no judge of any court shall sit as such in any case or proceeding in which he is a party or in which he is interested. While the judge denied that his stock ownership would influence his decision, this was too blatant even for GM. Shamefaced, it forgot the Black injunction and allowed legal matters to cool a while before seeking another one. The exposure proved a boon to the workers' cause as it hit the front pages of every paper in the country and exposed GM's complete control of the political machinery of Flint, but the company had just started. GM brings in its goons. All of a sudden, there appeared on the scene an organization called the Flint Alliance. It claimed to be composed of quote unquote loyal GM workers who were laid off in other plants because of the Fisher body strike and who were demanding an end to the minority rule. The president of this group turned out to be one George Boyson, a former Buick paymaster and then owner of a company manufacturing spark plugs, obviously loyal to GM. The treasurer was revealed as a former Flint City official who had been convicted of embezzling city funds. So widespread was the anger among the loyal workers that these two were picked as the main officers of the Flint Alliance. In reality, the alliance was set up both as a strike-breaking group and to mobilize vigilante action against the sit-downers. It was composed principally of GM supervisors, of which were there were hundreds, and businessmen. Foremen descended on non-struck plans with membership cards, attempting to intimidate workers into signing. Several received a going over when they refused to join. More than half the cards were filled out with names such as John Fink and James Stool Pigeon or Strikebreaker, and Mr. Sloan with the comment added, "I own General Motors and its employees." GM took pictures of crowds of workers supposedly demonstrating to go back to work. The demonstrators later turned out to be men waiting for their paychecks. The company was pushing its back to work movement through the Flint Alliance, claiming that a minority of strikers were dictating to a majority of non-strikers. Actually, the union was signing up thousands of men and women into the UAW every day. Even those workers who were not on strike and not in the union, let it be known, by their presence at demonstrations and picket lines, their sympathies were with the sit-downers. GM continued its refusal even to meet with the union unless the strikers vacated the plants. And of course, the union said they would not do so unless guaranteed that the company would not fill them with scabs, a pledge which GM would never agree to. The tension mounted. Cries were heard in Congress for outlawing sit-down strikes. A Detroit clergyman saw, quote unquote, Soviet planning behind the strike. The AFL leadership urged the workers to go back to work, but the workers, marvelously organized and in high spirits, sat tight. So GM finally turned to violence.
And with that, we'll break for our last round of discussion periods for tonight.
Yeah, how long did this strike last? I'm sorry if I didn't hear how long it lasted.
Oh, we still didn't even get to. We're still not even halfway through it at this point. The strike lasted a few months, started in December.
Okay,
Right now we're only up to January in the timeline.
thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm just gonna know this is the most inspirational story I've heard in like years. Like even more interesting than the Battle of Stalingrad. Like they never talk about this in the mainstream media or like it's public schools because they would rouse you. Okay, bye.
Thank you. And if you're inspired so far, come back next week because we haven't even gotten to the major points of the strike yet.
Yeah, no, doing the research for this class, it's amazing. All the tactics the company tries to do and local, civic, and federal levels that we still see to this day. It's honestly nothing new. And it's just amazing.
No, it's not. And as we'll see we'll see next week, it goes deeper. This is by far not the most violent strike of all time. But the company does bring violence.
Well, listening to the history of this, I am just so inspired and impressed by the organization of these workers. And something that kept coming up in my mind is the similarities and differences that I saw with this strike and the student encampments that happened across college campuses in protest of the genocide in Gaza. I was present at Cornell at that time, so I guess that was this spring. I was staff at Cornell, working, helping a professor do research. And I visited the encampment several times, and there were somewhat similar things. You know, there were people teaching classes, there were people providing food and water, you know, making sure that everybody was comfortable. But with Comrade D'Angelo's comment in mind about, you know, this was not a movement led by workers. This was not a movement led by working class people. It was mostly petit bourgeois, or frankly, bourgeois, very wealthy students who were not employed, leading this protest for, I think, a just moral cause. But it was always kind of bound to fail because it wasn't very well organized. It didn't have communist leadership. And it was, you know, a bunch of rich kids.
Well said.
I'm impressed by, it's night and day between the organization between these workers and the strike breakers. The workers, they pretty much organize the whole microcosm of society within this plant. Meanwhile, the strike breakers, not knowing how to deal with it, had to resort to very obvious plans, that were so easy to identify to out to the world. It really is embarrassing on the part of GM here, especially the Judge Black and his obvious ties to the plant. So
Yeah, and when you get into that, it'll be for those that weren't on the Harry Bridges class, or those that don't remember the Harry Bridges class when we did this. Of course, if I had the Harry Bridges School of Labor, it was part of our series on the history of the CIO. It goes even further. The lengths the organizers took to subvert the stool pigeons. And I left it in here. It's an old-timey term, but the stoolies that was used, because the term we always used to, historically it was used in labor to talk about these rats, for lack of a better term. What was done and how they succeeded. I've heard several people here talk about tonight how they're inspired. Unfortunately, I'm gonna miss next week's class. But I wish I didn't have to, because I'm to see the reaction that the same people would have about when we get into the deeper discussion of the essentially counterinsurgency that was done. It was amazing. And it's just what was done in the strike and what they had to do to win. I don't think much of labor is prepared to do anything similar nowadays.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm thankful you guys are have organized this class. It really is one of the most important moments, I think, in U.S. history. It was a turning point. It was pivotal. Also, I noticed a lot of similarities. If you notice the astroturfing that the company was doing to try to make it look like there was more opposition against the strikers, you can see a lot of that today in a lot of just different movements, including the labor movement. Like everything that's going on with Amazon. You know, the way they tried to paint strikers out like everybody was outsiders, and you know, it just shows you that their tactics don't change. Like they have a playbook, and like this strike, I think more than most other strikes, I think, like, put the cards on the table. You could see their hand, and those tactics have not changed over the years. There has not been a substantial, you know, you hear a lot of theorists and all that claim that we live in a different society and things are so different. They're not. The playbook is the same. I think that this strike is, I would urge everybody to look into this deeply as much as possible. There's a good book by Sidney Fine on the sit-down strike. I would recommend it. Lays everything out.
Thank you. I think everybody here heard the passion of Carl's voice as a senior organizer, and yeah, I know this is something we live every day. And a lot of us, the labor movement wouldn't be where it is today if the Flint Sit-Down Strike didn't happen, and there's no doubt about that.
Right. And I thought it was mentioned, I think it was the union, it was their demands. Was it 30-hour work weeks? If I'm not mistaken, 5-day weeks, 30 hours. I don't know if that actually was negotiated, but it wasn't. Well, it makes me think, you know, we were talking about current events back in 2008 when I believe GM filed for bankruptcy, or they didn't file, but they were going to go bankrupt, and the government bailed them out. I mean, we bailed them out. And the only thing I remember from that era was, what was it? The Wall Street protests in the streets. What was that called again? I can't even remember what it's called. But it just goes to show there was such a big difference from now to then. I remember people saying at that time, oh, the work, you know, like the auto workers, they don't work enough. They need it. That was why the whole system failed, whatnot. But it's evident that it's right, because they were just spreading those same lies that they did in 1936. But it's something that just gets regurgitated over and over again. That's all. I'm kind of going on a tangent. Occupy Wall Street. Thank you.
Great. So I just want to say a couple things. I'm shocked nobody caught on in this last section. I know there was some discussions of it when we had the Harry Bridges class, but there was a lot of petty bourgeois support for the strike. And of course it was split. I don't know if everybody, in that one of the last couple of slides, it was mentioned the Flint Alliance. So the leader of the Flint Alliance owned a company that made spark plugs for GM. So of course they were tied to GM, and GM, you know, they needed GM to succeed in order for their business to be profitable. And then you had all the smaller shopkeepers that, you know, needed those workers' money to go in to that shop and purchase or food or beverage or anything. So the small shopkeepers whose livelihoods were relying on the workers' money supported the strike, and those who were relying on GM supported GM. Just a little thing to notice. And of course, in that last slide, we can't forget about the time period that this took place. Of course, just a little over 3 years earlier than this was the business plot to try to overthrow FDR. It mentioned clergymen in Detroit saw Soviet planning in the strike. This was, and of course, the Black Legion was involved in the strike. The Flint Alliance was a fascist group itself. And then this clergyman that saw Soviet planning in the strike, can't forget who that was, Father Koffel. So this was a time, and this was a center of where as a fight back against the GM strike, where the fascist movement in the U.S. was growing as well. And of course, we see who won. You know, not to give a spoiler for next week's class, but we already know. All right, with that, if there's no more questions or comments, we'll go to our closeout. And next we have the New Outlook Publishers section. The latest release from New Outlook Publishers was collaboration with Labor United Educational League, and it's William Z. Forster's Industrial Unionism. Check that out. If you read that, these Z. Forster's ideas on industrial unionism, you see a lot of similarities to how things were organized in Flint and how the industrial unions and the CIO were organized. And of course, purchasing books through New Outlook Publishers does help support the school. And we have a great closeout song for you tonight, the official song of the sit-down strike, as performed by the Manhattan. I forget what the name of the chorus is.